setting us up so nicely for the conversation that we're about to have. I saw a number of questions on poll everywhere that are really relevant to what we're going to be talking about. You know, what are the obstacles from the lab to the living room divide? Who gets included in the we when making decisions about the future of CRISPR? These are all questions that we want to try to address in this panel here. So many of you may have seen, despite the paywall, the paper that came out in Science last week that really underscored the importance and appetite for broad public participation, broad public engagement around CRISPR. And left out really is this question of, well, how do we do it? And so I think that's what we want to really explore in this panel. We want to understand what are the societal perceptions of CRISPR? How can we engage more effectively with the public? Who are those publics? And how can we ensure that we're engaging with underserved communities? So those are some of the issues that we'll try to tackle in the next hour. I want to remind you that this is not a panel or a conversation about pushing this idea that we need to convince people that they should accept CRISPR. That's not the purpose of this panel. And I also want to acknowledge that despite the fact that we have a really rich set of panelists up here, and they all have a very different ways in which they engage with science communication, they all have roughly a US focus. And so I want to acknowledge that there are other publics out there that we need to be thinking about as we engage this conversation today. And if you have experience in some of those other publics or other geographies, I really welcome you to contribute questions on the online platform. So with that, let's dig in on this conversation about CRISPR in the public eye and the societal perceptions of this science. This is how we're going to run this panel. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves very briefly, and then I'll ask a few questions, but we really want to leave the majority of the time to hear from all of you. So true public engagement, true engagement. So we're going to leave about half of the time to really address the questions that are coming from the floor. So with that, I will ask you, Ting, to kick us off with a brief introduction of who you are and how you come to this issue.
My name is Ting Wu. I am a geneticist in the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School. I run the lab with about 8 to 9 individuals, sometimes you go up to 10 or 15. And we focus on trying to understand how the genome is packaged inside the nucleus, because we believe that is actually another key to how inheritance happens and how the genome is activated. We also invent technologies for imaging the genome down to 20 nanometer resolution or less. But in addition, I have a group that works on trying to bridge the gap in communication between individuals who are not scientists and geneticists and other scientists, because that two-way communication is extremely important for how we do our research.
Thanks. Rick?
Okay. My name is Rick Lover. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences. We're based in Los Angeles. It's our job to connect scientists, engineers, and medical professionals to folks in Hollywood, storytellers. We're making feature films, TV shows, and video games. Since November of 2008, when we opened our doors, we've done over 2,000 consults, including consults on every Marvel film since Iron Man 2, not called Deadpool. And we do a lot with, basically, if you're a Hollywood creative, you can call us with a question about science. We'll connect you with a scientist or engineer for free. And we've done over 250 live events, mostly in New York and Los Angeles, geared towards Hollywood and the entertainment industry.
I'm Roxy Beck with the Center for Food Integrity, and we're a nonprofit organization that bridges the food system together, thinking about all of the entities that bring food to people. So we work across the food system, and I focus on some of our consumer-focused initiatives, including a website called Best Food Facts, where we take university experts and have them answer all questions from the science-y to the silly for consumers about food.
I'm Michael Spector. I work for the New Yorker, but we're use fake news. The fake news I also produces genetics and cultural biotechnology, and for the last 1,000 years, or what seems like it. I've been working on a book about editing DNA. So these are issues that are dear to my brain, if not my heart.
I think this notion that you produce fake news is an alternative fact. So we're going to dig in.
Putting it out there.
We're going to dig into public perceptions, and I have a question for you, Roxy. So you've thought a lot about people's perception of modified food, and have said that, quote, science alone doesn't assure people about food. So at the Center for Food Integrity, you've developed a trust model, and I wonder if you can share some of the highlights of that model with us.
Yeah. So backing up about 10 years when we were founded, the mission of the Center for Food Integrity is to earn consumer trust and confidence in the full food system. We thought about how are we going to do that? We better have some research that's going to validate that thinking. So we went and worked with the social scientists at Iowa State University, did a meta-analysis of 21 different studies that looked at trust building specifically for food and agriculture. And what we came back with was a model, some consistencies between all of those different studies. Three indicators of trust, how we build trust. The first thing is the person from which the information comes, so the influential other. These are the credentialed people we have in our lives, mechanics, doctors, dietitians, as well as the social sphere of influence we have around us, family, friends. The second consistent piece for building trust was competence. So do you have the proper science and facts and knowledge to be able to say what you're saying? Or do you have the technical skills or capabilities to do a job? And the third element was confidence, or the perception of a shared value. So are you someone like me? Do you share my worldviews? These are the sorts of things that are much more intrinsic. And at the end of the day, I pulled a quote here that was it was an article talking about how did the clean eating era, how did it land and how does it look the way it does today. And I thought this quote pretty well sums up what we learned in our research, which I'll highlight here. But the quote was, "To insist on the facts made us come off as cruelly negative," us being the food industry. We had punctured the happy belief bubble of glowiness that they had come to imbibe from a blogger. So those three indicators of trust, who it comes from, whether they have the competence to say what they're saying, and whether they're a person like me, whether I share their beliefs, were not created equal. In this industry that we are focused on, food and agriculture, we have always tried to make decisions based on who we are as experts within the field and the facts and data that we can utilize to support our cause. What the research showed us is that it is 3 to 5 times more important to have a confidence connection, a values-based connection with people, than it is to have facts alone. So stated differently, facts are 3 to 5 times less important than capturing or connecting through values. So we've had this exactly backwards in our way that we're trying to connect with the consuming public. If we just give them more facts, certainly they'll come to our side. If those facts don't prove to them, we'll go back to the research labs, we'll do more research, and we'll come back to them with more facts. And what happens, instead of starting with a common topic and being able to have conversation, we're driven further and further away simply because our facts don't match the questions they're answering. There was a question that came across on Twitter about can science do what we're asking it to do? The answer with CRISPR is absolutely yes. But science, being able to answer a can question is different than society's question, which is being asked, which is should we be doing this? So when we're faced as a scientific community answering questions about should, and we come forward with can answers, we're missing the mark. We're not connecting at that values-based level, because should questions are all about ethics and beliefs, and you don't change ethics and beliefs with facts and science alone.
Thanks, Roxy. So, Roxy, you think a lot about food and agriculture. Ting, you're in the medical world, so do elements of Roxy's model apply to perceptions of the technology in medicine?
Absolutely, they apply perfectly. I think Roxy and I have been talking about this a bit. I should tell you, the part of my lab that works on trying to make connections with the public is called the Personal Genetics Education Project, and we went out in the beginning through schools. We didn't actually teach genetic facts, because the second we tried to, the kids would fall asleep. Or they would just not pay attention. So what we found out very quickly, we've been doing this now for 11 years, what we do is we go in and we talk about the sticky ethical problems that really bother them. Now we focus a lot on the disenfranchised, underserved communities, where DNA, when you say DNA, what pops into their head is not, oh, medical miracles. That's how we get thrown in jail. So we would go straight to those complicated issues, and in doing that, we realized that we started to establish a conversation that would eventually lead to what we hope would be trust. And I want to focus on that a little bit. So having learned from that several years ago, we've been taking an approach of talking about social justice or social injustice, and that very quickly connects us with our audience. Now, a few years ago, I met Michael Friend and Shakir Cannon, who you're going to hear from eventually, and we were invited by them to go down to Baltimore to meet with a congregation of, I think it was 100 to 200 or maybe more than 200 black pastors, black ministers, because we realized that we were not, in all our efforts, reaching a community, the black community, not hearing from them how they were viewing what was going on. As I said before, it's a two-way conversation that we need. So we went down expecting that there would be a room full of at least 100 to 200 black ministers. I brought a contingency down with me. Ann Merchant from the Exchange came with us. Other people from my group came. And we walked into the room, and I would say we brought about 7 people. We outnumbered the number of black ministers that were in that room. It was so dramatic that I couldn't pretend like the room was full. So eventually I asked one of the pastors, where are the other 100 or 200 members of your community? And at first he said, it's summer, not too many people show up in the summer. But I knew that every Monday, 75 of them got together to talk. So we went ahead with the meeting, and I would say by the afternoon, we had made connection with each other. And a pastor came up to me and said, you want to know why we're not here? We're not here because people like you at Harvard are just like Johns Hopkins people. You come, you promise, you take, you never come back. So it's an issue of trust. But we kept talking, and we learned so much. And we talked about this problem, and I think we established a trust, and we are continuing to work at it. Most recently, we've been trying to connect with the Muslim community, and the person on my team who's been trying to reach them has told me he never gets any phone calls back. He's Muslim himself. And just yesterday, he told me he found out it's because there's no trust, and so we have to work on that. So I agree with you 100%. It's trust.
So, Ting, building on that, how can we really ensure that all voices are represented in these discussions and that we are reaching all of those underserved communities whose trust has been weakened over time?
How do we do this? I think that's what we all struggle with, and seeing what happened this past weekend, I'm sure we've all been thinking about it nonstop. It's hard not to think about what's going on. So actually, as the last panel was talking, I wrote down some notes because I think most of us are shocked at how bad things are. And I thought, what hurts people? I think it's being left out, being denied, and being judged. So I think the judgment is particularly difficult. So I think, judgment, we have to think about how we're going to handle that. But being left out, if I had to point to one thing that we've done poorly, it's the abuse of not informing someone, not talking to them. Maybe even more than what we talk about. So maybe the first step is this conversation that we're all having in a non-judgmental way, in a non-denying way. It's just not leaving people out of this conversation, all people.
Thank you. So, Michael, I'm going to turn to you, a journalist with an important and big platform. How do we manage to communicate about CRISPR in a way that engages people, but also moves us beyond this, this is the greatest technology ever, versus CRISPR's going to destroy the world and lead to designer babies? So where's the balance, and what role do journalists play in helping us explore that middle space?
It's a problem. I mean, I'm in a weird and favored position because my magazine runs very long stories. So in theory, I could explain and be dispositive if I did the pieces properly. That's not true for most places. You don't have a lot of space. And people, it's very easy to write stories that will scare the crap out of people, especially with CRISPR. I've traveled around a lot on this book, and I could just write a book about how horrible it is. But I think the opposite. You can craft your communication in whatever way you want if you're even marginally good at your job. And what we have to do is it's sort of what these guys said, we have to get people excited about, and that sort of shares our values part of it is the only thing in the end that matters. Because facts clearly do not. And I was really impressed. In the course of reporting on this book, I've been a bunch of times to Nantucket, where an MIT scientist named Kevin Estad is trying to edit mice on that island so they become resistant to Lyme disease. And I've also been to Africa, where the Gates Foundation, target malaria, intends and hopes to get rid of malaria by editing innocuous mosquitoes. And in both those instances, the teams are spending years reaching out. They understand, as people have not before, that science is not the limiting factor, it's the connection. And I think they're doing a great job. Nantucket's a super anti-GMO place, but when Kevin got up there, he said, non-profit, non-corporate, up to you, I'll stop whenever you want me to. And they love that, but you know what they really love? This is an issue that is very painful for them. I interviewed a guy in Mali who is a witch doctor, though he prefers, I think the technical term is mystical healer. And he has imprecations against GMOs. He hates them. And I said, well, what do you think about this idea of like bringing mosquitoes to fly to, just change the genetics of an entire species? He said, I would bring them tomorrow if there was a way to do it. Because everyone in his family has been sick or died. There's nobody down there who has not suffered badly from malaria. So one of the problems, I think, with GMOs, I say this after many years, and I should have realized it earlier, is I'm 1,000,000% pro-GMO. But I don't think very many people get up in the morning in this country and say, oh my God, I'm so happy we have GMO corn. It's good. I'm happy there's some farmers. Don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of it. But it doesn't hit you here. And it's really hard to communicate your love of GMO corn, because when I say that, they see my love of Monsanto. And which I'm totally fine with, by the way. Sorry, but so what matters is connecting to people on something that they care about, and not talking down to them. People always ask me, do people read these endless stories in the New Yorker? Well, except for my mother, they do. And I know this because I get lots of mail, and a lot of it isn't the most favorable, but that's fine. They engage with it. And you can communicate with people if you don't talk down to them. And we do a lot of talking down, and so do scientists. And that has to stop. And I do think these issues, the sort of Martha's Vineyard and Mali, which are just small little examples, and neither one is done yet, but they may give me a lot of hope, and it's something I have not had for a lot of years about this stuff.
Great, thanks. So, Rick, I want to turn to you. We just saw in the poll before the session started that people get their information, rivaling social media. A lot of people are getting their information from print, but also television, which probably was the driver there. You work with people from Hollywood. Do people trust Hollywood? It seems that they're getting their information from Hollywood. And is Hollywood interested in CRISPR? And if so, how will Hollywood influence or affect public perceptions of CRISPR?
I think it was number 4, actually, on the list. Number 4 out of the 6. But
That was one.
But I think I don't know if people trust Hollywood. I don't know if that's quite how to characterize it, but I think people trust the characters that they've come to know and love over the years in Hollywood. I think if you can get Spock to say something about science, then people take an interest and people automatically trust the words coming out of his mouth just because Spock feels like an actual family member, and there's literature to support that. That people think they know the characters that they spent long periods of time with. And so for us, it's the goal of our program to get those characters who are going to hopefully influence the next generation of kids to just say a little nugget, to say a little something about science. I think whether or not Hollywood is interested in CRISPR, I was actually just talking about this to Daniel over there. It's like, I think that there are a couple of definitive films that have come out about genetic modification, especially in humans. I think Gattaca is kind of like the shorthand. And I do think that Hollywood would be interested in another Gattaca. Like, that's one of those movies like Groundhog Day, that you just say, oh, Groundhog Day, and that you know exactly what you're talking about. So in pitch meetings, Gattaca is one of those touchstones. But, I think that it's something that, unless it's a background technology, cracking that story of what CRISPR is going to be, I think worlds in which CRISPR and genetic modification have taken different directions are, Hollywood's replete with those, but for a movie that focuses in on one in the narrative realm, I don't know what that story specifically would be. So anyway, I think that what our program tries to do, and sort of the mission that we're sort of all driven by at our program, is to not necessarily have that idea on behalf of Hollywood and take it to Hollywood on a silver platter, but to take folks like yourselves, like many of the people in this room, to Hollywood, introduce them, and suggest that the two have an informal meeting and just a dialogue. And from that, and Tig's participated in that, I know you participated in some capacity in some of our events. So like, for us, over time, if we just figure if we can get the two communities together and getting to know each other, then we'll leave it to the Hollywood folks to have the great idea about what the CRISPR storyline will be.
Great, and of course we heard in the last panel that one of our panelists watched Captain America in order to prep for this meeting, so don't underestimate the impact that you're having.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we not talk so much about CRISPR when we're reaching out to people. I mean, CRISPR is the latest iteration of gene editing. There have been others. This is better. This is more easy to, it's easily used. It's easily explained. But it's a part of a long process that started with the understanding of what DNA was. It's much more valuable to talk about what the thing you're using CRISPR for can do. But nobody's going to care about editing the genes of mice if it gets rid of Lyme disease. At least nobody, I live in Hudson Valley, in my part of the world. That's what you need to focus on. The thing you're trying to do, not the technique, not the way you do it in the lab. I don't think people care, nor do they necessarily need to care.
Great. So as promised, we want to engage with all of you and hear your questions and your ideas around how to engage with the public and what influences public perceptions technology. So let's look at some of the questions that you've upvoted here. How can we engage people with very polarized and poorly founded views of genetic engineering? Anyone want to take that one? See?
I'd be happy to. Are very often the fault of people such as myself, because we have not engaged properly. And I would say it's not difficult to engage in conversation, because first, we learn a lot about what we've not expressed well. Second of all, if you take out the details of what they've misunderstood, there's a lot of wisdom in what they're saying, a lot of opinions that we need to pay attention to, so we can engage at the level of humanity, I guess. And then once we have the conversation going, we can go into the details. But I would agree, the details are actually not what people's concerns are.
Great. So, Michael, you write for the public. What are some of the most pressing aspects of CRISPR that we need to engage the public on?
Again, I mean, I've written a lot of words about what CRISPR is. As soon as you say the word palindrome, you've lost 70 million people. I actually think it's kind of cool that it's a palindrome, but I'm a weird guy. So I think the way that you have to engage people is to get them interested in the thing that you're writing about. Are they interested in fixing a disease that their father died of? And my dad had Alzheimer's. I spent a bunch of time in somebody's lab using CRISPR to take one allele that is highly indicative of Alzheimer's and increases your risk, cut it out, and replace it with something that lowers the risk. I mean, it was sort of a game. It's not that easy. It's easy if you have a famous molecular biologist helping you, as I did. But it's much easier than other methods. But when I tell people that, they get that. The other thing we need to do more than anything else is every third grader in America should be editing C. elegans, putting make genes in, make them glow red, then make them glow blue. Let kids come home and say, I turned a worm green today. They'll care the way I cared about blowing up stuff when it's my generation, it's not.
Well, we do consumer research year over year and have done that for 10 years, not just looking at the model of how we earn trust, but to all of the different issues within food and agriculture. And when we even ask consumers about issues outside of agriculture, anything that has a direct impact on me has a much higher level of concern or skepticism. And fun fact, females more than males, every single issue, no matter food related or not, have a higher level of skepticism, and early adopters versus later adopters have a higher level of skepticism or concern. The other piece that I would add to what Ting has said is we've built, based on our research and our trust model, we've built a training program around helping people be in these conversations effectively on controversial and complex issues within this food world, this science world. And one of the things that's been beneficial for me to understand is when we work with experts, university experts who are struggling to be effective in these communications, we've said be a person first and an expert third. Don't try to focus only on what you know. Focus on how you're like them to build that values-based connection. You're going to understand through that process what is it that's meaningful for them and what half or quarter truth have they come to this conversation with that's not allowed them to connect or not allowed them to believe that science is the answer in any of these complex conversations.
So Roxy, you talked a lot about how we build trust, but I want to address this question about what the drivers of public mistrust are. So it's related, but a little bit flipping that on its head. So can you talk about what drives mistrust?
I think it's the perception that scientists, the industry, isn't listening. That's one piece, and our training program addresses that. You have to listen first for shared value, for a layer of concern that you agree with, and start there. I think so many of the conversations that we have around science in general and politics, our world, are about what can we disagree about. And we spend all of our time and energy and resources focusing on how we don't agree. If we can set aside what we don't agree about and focus on what we do agree on, we want the malaria reducing mosquito. If we can agree on the why we're here and the what we want to accomplish, then the how we get it done becomes much less tedious. We can spend much less time and much more meaningful conversation in those areas. I think the other piece that we see come up a lot in the mistrust is there have been enough examples of missteps by the industry where the industry has chosen a path, it ended up not being the right one, and through that process, consumers were never involved in the conversation. So it's a direct, that comment, direct dovetail from the previous panel, saying nobody has even involved us in the conversation. So let's have a conversation before we try to dictate the outcome of any conversation we think is worth having. That perception of profit is another place where if the closer you are to profit, the less I can trust you, is kind of the consumer mentality. So when they see large multinational corporations being in conversations and controlling, in our case, the food system, that's a true problem for them. And as mentioned earlier, CRISPR, is so accessible, so usable. The barriers, to entry are low. So this could be one of those opportunities that provides such a huge, wonderful, stories. And I think, Michael, we need you to tell the stories of the positives and all of the stories. All of the stories. We at Center for Food Integrity don't take a position on any issue, any product, any company, even those members that we have. But we want the good, accurate science to come out. We don't want it to be dumbed down. We want it to be relevant to the people who are asking the questions. And oftentimes that relevancy is determined based on, help me understand why this is something that you're thinking about. Help me understand what more you want to know about. Because people can come into a conversation with a loaded statement and cover 3 or 4 different issues. And if we try to respond with an answer to a loaded conversation or a statement, we'll likely lose. If we start asking more questions about why they've come to those conclusions, or where they read that, or why that's important to them, we're going to be far better in addressing the concerns that they're bringing forward that, frankly, millions of people are probably thinking about.
Great. Ting, can you share some of your perspective on what drives mistrust? You talked about this a little bit earlier, but maybe expand on that a little bit.
So it may be, I'll speak personally, as a scientist, you pick a problem. You're not really creating a product. You're picking a problem. You're trying to understand that problem. And it is, without exaggeration, 95% troubleshooting, 5% getting a hunch, followed by years of troubleshooting. And you feel that no one is going to really want to be interested, no one's going to be interested in all that troubleshooting, although you think about it day and night. So in a way, it's almost as if we think we need to present a product to the public, but in reality, we're just in the process of discovery or invention. And I think what scientists could do better is to include their public in the ups and downs of sciences, so that their expectation of us is much more realistic, and they can see that we fail by far the majority of the time. I think the other piece is we spend a lot of money doing this research. People hear all the time, $40 million granted here and $6 million granted there, and they don't see the product. So maybe the product needs to be our life struggle, and we will probably hear good advice too as we go along the way.
Thanks. I want to hear from all of the panelists on the next question because I think it's an interesting one. But I'm going to start with you, Rick, and hear, in the context of your program, what counts as successful public engagement?
For us, we set the bar actually remarkably low at the Science and Entertainment Exchange in terms of how we engage Hollywood, because if we came in and were prescriptive and we said, that character can't say that character can't do that character can't be that, we'd get a pat on the head, and unless we were coming in with a producer credit when we were sitting at the head of the table, there's just no reason for Hollywood to listen when it comes to narrative film. But if you come in and you make a better offer, and you come in and you say, that's an interesting idea that Gattaca reboot you're working on. The technology's come a long way since then. We know a lot more. Have you ever considered this? Have you ever considered this other aspect of something that's going to be controversial or in a gray area? And if you can give a storyteller a really great idea and come out of that meeting thinking, wow, that for us is the win. There are far too many, I think a lot of folks, when they think about Hollywood, they think that the process of making a movie is somehow organized. It's chaos, it's a total mess, and no movie gets made the same way, and so, even the big studio films. So for us to just come in and recognize the number of voices that are in play, and recognize that, we're not coming at this from a position of being able to dictate, but we are coming at it with a chance to inspire people. That for us has to be defined as the win, and then everything that comes after it. If we can get to that point, and we have in our program gotten to that point where, and one of the big examples we had early in the program was we were doing a consult on the original Thor film, and if you go back and read the comic books, and I'm nerdy that way, so I have, the original Jane Foster character was a nurse, and I won't go through the long-winded version of the story, but the end result was, through a conversation with a theoretical physicist at Caltech, the Jane Foster character, because of narrative reasons in the story that made sense, and the outcome was that that character was a theoretical physicist. And I would argue that female theoretical physicists are underrepresented on the big screen in Hollywood. And so that for us was a huge win. But you can't have all those kinds of wins if you're not willing to just go in there and take all those other meetings where they're like, yeah, that's not going to fit in the story. So that's all.
Right. Other thoughts? Yeah, Michael.
There's a guy named Kent Redford, maybe known to some of you, is a very gifted conservation biologist. And he had said to me a couple of months ago, where are the CRISPR versions of, where are the upbeat Gattacas and the upbeat Jurassic Parks? Like, let's have a rom-com that features CRISPR. I'm not totally kidding. When things like that filter into the popular imagination, they become less threatening. When everything's about the guy that ate Pittsburgh but was created in someone's lab, you get a certain point of view. And I think there's too much of that, and I really think there's too much not listening. I mean, that's true of many, many scientists, and certainly of my generation. I think it's younger people are much better. And journalists are, in general, interested in whatever, the famous "it bleeds, it leads" is mostly truth. I mean, people are paid for and attracted to extremely engaging, horrifying stories, and there's no end of them in what I do. I mean, you could just do it all day long, and it's cheap and it's easy. It's like fast food. And you gotta resist that, because actually the longer thing is cooler. I mean, the stuff that many of you people are doing in your labs it's mind-blowing. So you don't have to make this stuff up. It's so cool. It's better than fiction. But we need to make sure people understand that. But they have to see a reason to care.
Great. Roxy,
Sure.
what does success look like for you?
For us, a couple ways when I think about the broad public. It's engaging with public, both through this website that I mentioned, Best Food Facts, allowing them to have engagement with experts and understanding, basic science to answer their questions about something that's really pretty complex. We also work with online influencers, so bloggers. We will put together blogger tours and bring them all around the country to showcase what is it that's going on in food production, in labs, on farms, at food processing companies. And in that transparent focus for us, the opportunity is the same as the risk. If we're going to open the barn doors, the processing, food processing facility doors, you have to allow them and trust them as much as they're trusting you by coming along for that journey. So you have to allow them to tell the story that represents their truths and the truth that they're seeing within the industry. So I think being willing to be transparent is one of those where we've seen great success, being willing to open those doors. Another way as well is, with our membership, looking at the full food system. When we're successful, food system stakeholders, the people who are procurement managers and who are making these decisions within their companies, within restaurants and retail, at the retail counters, who are making decisions about what will be stocked on shelves or what foods will come into their restaurants, we have to do a better job of not just trying to reach the end consumer, but those people who are influencing what the food system and the food choices that they have actually looks like. We've developed a coalition on responsible gene editing in agriculture specifically for that goal. We're this close, within the next 30 days, we will have a finalized version of responsible use guidelines for gene editing, specifically in food and agriculture, that it sets the precedent for this is what we as a community believe should be the responsible use principles we all agree to. And the next stage of that, or phase 2, is reaching out to the food system. So when we're successful with that, we will have this dialogue with the industry and the decision makers within the industry so that they can have good access great access to people who have the information that they're ultimately going to be responsible for answering questions about. Because did they allow that to come into their food company? Did they allow that to end up on their store shelves or show up on their menu for the consumers they're serving?
Right. Ting, what does success look like for you?
So this looks like the beginning of success. I think success would also be, no matter what community we go to, we can have a meeting like this. Sometimes I think about how when the nation, the world put its mind to making sure people were aware of HIV and AIDS, things went very quickly, and so though not everyone is aware, they are much more aware now. I think that's a good sign of success. And I think maybe real success is when we lower the angst and people are confident to express their opinion, not be worried about being judged, and when they go to a physician, everyone feels confident saying, I do or I do not want to do this genetic test.
Great, thanks. So I want to move to this top question now that reads, communicating science is always difficult, but especially so in the face of deliberate misinformation. Have we seen specific misinformation campaigns targeted at CRISPR, and what should we do when we encounter them?
I haven't seen any, but it's sort of simple what you do. Tell the truth, tell the facts, give people the honest story. The credibility of the New Yorker exists in many people's minds because we tried really hard to get it right. There are some people who won't buy that, but most people do. And it's true. That's how you're credible. You have to fight misinformation and lies with the truth. I don't know any shorthand for that. And we're going through a difficult time, obviously, right now, but I think that's an understatement. But I do see, there will be a better day. And it will come from people who care enough to try and to tell the truth and to write the truth and to reach people. It will not come from Washington.
Any thoughts? Okay, let's move to this question about social media, which was, as the author of this question points out, the main source of information in the poll at the beginning of the session. So given this, how can we bring more information to a wider audience? And how can we outbalance misinformation, again, that's unavoidably spread? And I might add to that, how can we break out of these echo chambers that we're living in on social media? Anyone want to take that? Roxy?
In our research, we asked specifically where are you getting information about food, and I didn't see all of the exact results, but online is where it's at. People, and the caveat to that is people still rely on friends and family who are not in the online space. So the charge is whoever you are and whatever circles you exist in, have conversations. Be willing to be open and embrace the skepticism that exists, because skepticism, if we pay attention to it, can breed true dialogue. We can get into this really deep conversations. Oftentimes they're not driven by fluffy, here's what's going on in science. It's here's what's ethically making you feel charged about this issue. So being online, being in person, being willing to be in conversations is kind of a prerequisite. I think a couple other pieces are set aside the goal of changing someone's opinion or perspective, because that's not your job. Your job is to be open and transparent and tell the truth. But if you go into conversations trying to change the opinion of somebody who's exactly on the opposite pole of an issue, you're likely going to lose every time, because you're going to go back to your facts, you're going to revert to your facts, and you'll lose. I think the other thing is be so willing to ask why that's important to you, or where did you, at least 3 times. So listen for what it is that's bothering somebody. Listen for an underlying issue. Listen for something that you have in common, and force yourself to get in the practice of asking questions, because the people you're talking to will absolutely come around and give you way more insights than their initial conversation lead-in or their question. But have the conversations where you exist, in your communities, if you're a coach of a team, if you're involved with your church, if you're involved with the local Rotary. Have conversations and be willing to spark a dialogue where it may not seem common or it may not seem usual, and truly be listening in those conversations for what may be charging people's passion.
When I give speeches to organizations like this, or educated people, I always say, how many of you have ever gone and spoken to a Rotary Club?
I think it is actually quite doable to make our overall awareness of genetic technologies so much better that we'll all be satisfied. We have strategies, we have approaches, we have tantalizing stories, we have Rick there working with producers and writers, and Rick really does a fantastic job. These writers and producers are very engaged. If I had to say what's holding us back, and it's going to sound so crude, but I really think this is it literally is funding. If there were sufficient funding, many of these issues of communication would be resolved, I would say, within a matter of 3 to 5 years. It's all doable. And then we would find everyone's questions. They would all have different issues, but they would be addressed.
I guess I would say that, where I think CRISPR is most likely to get like the name check in a Hollywood movie is probably The Island of Dr. Moreau. And I would say that what I really want to try to do as someone who has this audience, both this audience here and also this audience back in LA, is to be that bridge to get that. It's not going to be necessarily the specifics of the technology. I think you articulated that very eloquently. It's going to be the story of the person who cures a major disease and what motivated them to do it. That's going to make that sort of hidden figures version of the CRISPR story that I think that's both what Hollywood's going to be very interested in and what I would really like to see happen. So those are the stories that hopefully we can bring in to that community and push out to the greater public. Because CRISPR, I think, the greater message is that CRISPR is a tool, I think, and that people are basically good, and hopefully we can put that out into the world.
Great.
There's something I forgot to say, but because there isn't someone from Africa here, I think I ought to say that. There's a lot of talk about, well, the rich people get all this cool technology and the poor people don't get anything. And generally that is true. If you look at the malaria project, if it works, if it were to work, you would get rid of vaccinations. You would get rid of people having to go in sub-Saharan Africa to clinics that it might take a day out of their life. They may be sick. You don't want to have to worry about refrigeration. You won't have to worry about medicine. If it worked, it would be one of the most, if not the most exciting scientific advance I could ever think of. And that would be more valuable for the poorest people on Earth than it would be for anyone else. So, it's not only, generally the rich people always get everything, but I think this might be an exception.
Great. Yeah.
There's a fray of risk tolerance that comes into this conversation, and that's to say, I think when people look at technology in food and we'll, throw GMOs in it, what doesn't work for them is, where's my benefit? Somebody made a decision, it helps them, somebody I don't have a connection to, either a big food or big company, a big tech provider, and a farmer who, Thomas, you're only less than 2% of the population, so I don't know one. And if it's only going to line either one of those folks' pockets with profit, I can't trust them anyway. So I think that's one of the big disconnects between what can be possible with CRISPR technology, in that there's a direct benefit to me, the consuming public, increased nutrition, something that has disease, bombing power. We can get rid of really terrible ailments that people are living with. It gets back to that, help me understand why this matters to me, and then I'll be okay. And that's not the whole story. You have to be willing to have that conversation, but because of the ways that this technology is being used across many different industries, all for the good of people, individuals, I think the ability to tell the stories of CRISPR are much better than a lot of the technology and innovation that we've seen in different industries that have been utilized effectively, but have had a couple bad actors or a couple bad stories that have been told that make people gravitate towards them and say, this is a case study of one that absolutely reflects all the case studies that could exist. Vaccines is something that comes to mind, and people's willingness to accept risk when everybody else but them is seeming to be empowered or life is better. People will not accept that in their life. If I can be part of the group that is, not only doesn't have a lot of risk, but also is being empowered or is getting some sort of kickback because of this, a positive, some sort of positive outcome, then I'm going to be more likely to come along. So I think that's, as it relates to the food side of things, being able to modify in a way that actually helps people check a box that's important to them is exciting in the CRISPR conversations.
Great. So we're coming up on time. So I want to spend the last 4 minutes asking each of you to give some final thoughts around our themes of societal perception of CRISPR and related technologies, how we engage the public, and how we engage specifically underserved communities. I'm going to start with you, Michael, and I'm going to give Ting the last word. So 1 minute or less.
Don't take people for granted. Don't speak down to them. They can handle it. And make it possible for people to get excited about the stuff you're doing, because it's really exciting. Yeah, there are risks. We haven't talked about them up here. There are plenty of risks and there are plenty of dangers, and we need to deal with those. But we can't just focus on those. We need to have some risk and benefit balance. And people will feel that if it's real. They'll feel it if it's real, if it is.
Awesome. I'm going to quote somebody who might even be in the room. I haven't seen him, but Jack Bobo from Intrexon. He says, so I'll borrow this from him. He said, if you believe me, my facts don't matter. If you don't believe me, my facts don't matter. So from our perspective, it all comes down to this idea of trust and believability. And so our recommendation is do everything that you can to understand the people that you're trying to connect with before you try to educate or change opinions. Through that process, you're going to know people, you're going to understand their concerns, and you're going to start to impact their feelings and beliefs because you have that true trust-based connection.
Great. Rick.
From where I'm sitting, I'm very appreciative to be here today. And the reason that I'm here today, besides Sarah asked and that would come in a heartbeat, is that really I'm here looking for folks who are interested in doing this kind of outreach work. So please do please do flag me down, and if you don't see me this evening, then please come to our website where we'll start the process on doing the kind of Hollywood outreach that we've been doing with you guys. I think this is a really important topic, and it's something that we'd like to engage Hollywood more on. So I'd love to have as many folks who are interested come out and communicate with storytellers in our culture.
Great. And what's that toll-free number again,
Oh,
Rick?
yeah. So it's very easy to remember. It's 844-NEED-SCI. If you want to reach me or the Science and Entertainment Exchange, it's 844-NEED-SCI.
Great. Ting, last word.
So working with Rick is great fun. So this is, I'm going to mention this. I've actually never mentioned this in a panel like this before, but, and I don't mean to say this is the most important thing, but I don't think we've mentioned it before. In addition to trust and having these conversations, I have found that in a room sometimes when things get really tense and we talk about scary things and distrust and abuse, sometimes what breaks the ice and works as well as trustful conversations is actually humor. Humor does a wonderful thing. It puts things into perspective. So at PGM, we've often thought about how do we find a cartoonist to put a little humor into these serious conversations that we have. It makes things more approachable.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for the great